webinar called Building a Resilient Workforce That Can Thrive in the Next New Normal. Is a sincere thanks to our CBRN sponsors. Today's webinar is hosted by Deloitte, and in just a moment I'm going to introduce our two distinguished panelists for today. Most of you do know me. I'll introduce myself. I'm Leah Nord. I'm the Senior Director of Workforce Strategies and Inclusive Growth here at the Canadian Chamber, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. Again, I did already remind everyone to please mute their lines. And if you take a look at the invitation, you'll also see the link to the Slido app. As we go through the presentation here today, please add your questions up to your questions as we will have a question and answer period here today following the presentation. And today we're going to cover a lot of ground, a lot of fascinating ground. We're going to discuss words and concepts such as accelerators, skills, digital skills, soft skills, upskilling, reskilling, lifelong learning. There'll be, discussions of AI and cybersecurity, distributive work, trust, leadership, inclusion, and diversity. So as you can see, we're going to cover the whole workforce gamut today. Really excited. Note that Deloitte has just issued its 2020 Global Human Capital Trends Report. I do believe this is the 10th year of that, and it's called the Social Enterprise at Work, a Paradox as a Path Forward. Today's conversation will pull from some of that work, but as some other insightful work Deloitte has been doing specific to the pandemic, specific to workforce, and specific to the work that our two panelists have been involved in. We will start with slides. You will see it's very conversational today, though. I think you'll really enjoy the format. We will have a Q&A session, and hopefully for a number of reasons here today, folks, we're going to try and wrap up as close to 2 as possible. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two panelists here today. Karen Pastakia is a partner in Deloitte's consulting business and leads the human capital consulting business in Toronto. She works with organizations to ensure there is alignment and integration between the overall business strategy and the organization's HR and talent agendas. As well, we've got Zabeen Hirji with us today, and as Deloitte's global advisor, she advises the firm and its clients on issues key to the transformation agendas of business and government. Areas of focus include lifelong learning and reskilling, redesigning work and workforce composition, culture, transformation, diversity and inclusion, and balancing short-term results and long-term sustainability. She is also an advisor to the Clerk of the Privy Council for the Government of Canada on diversity and inclusion. Sabine, I'm going to hand it over to you first. I'm going to share my screen here and pull up the presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure for both Karen and myself to be here, and we do hope to make this as conversational as possible. We would love to have your questions, and I think Leah will be managing those, but please send your questions as you think about them, and we're happy, Leah, to take them as we're going through these as well. So just, and I did chuckle when you said distinguished guests. I looked around for my mother, but Karen may be distinguished, but we're not accustomed to be called that, are we, Karen?
No, not daily, no.
Yeah, exactly. So we actually quite enjoyed that. So what we're going to do is start with a macro overview of the future of work, and really frame it with the same framing that we used pre-COVID, but then very much get into what have the impacts of COVID been, and then we'll get into very specific and things that organizations are doing to really come out of this, to recover, and ultimately to thrive again. So while we have certain slides we're going to cover off, we're going to try to have a conversation and really jump in as required. So while you're getting the slides set up, the theme of the presentation really is around how COVID has been has fast forwarded us into the future of work, and many things that could have would have otherwise taken months or years have actually happened in a matter of days or weeks. Let me start with the key themes then, the key drivers of the future of work. And the first one that pops up into everyone's mind is technology. And you're all very familiar with how automation, AI is driving the future of work. And what we see really is this fusion of human and technology as opposed to technology versus human. And how do you deploy it in a way where technology is doing things that it's good at that humans don't do as well or can't do, and that the humans their work is going to evolve so that they're actually doing higher value work and work that's inherently human. And Karen will touch more on that aspect. But if we stop to think about how COVID has really accelerated the use of technology, think about healthcare. In the last month, about 80% of healthcare visits were done online or on the phone. That is something that would probably never have happened, never mind in the next 10 years. But out of necessity, we actually figured out a way to do that. And so this drive to digitization, whether it's services or goods and online shopping, has accelerated tremendously. Another one of our clients said they reached their 5-year goal for digital or online shopping in a matter of weeks. And that has a lot of implications, of course, for the workforce. So if you can fast forward a couple of slides now. Next one, I think. That's a slide. So the second, go back one, please. The second trend is demographics. And there are many aspects there that we can talk about, but I do want to focus on a couple that have more significant implications. We know in terms of women, 48% of the Canadian workforce is female, and women are not fully represented in all segments nor in all leadership levels. What we also have are two other things that are different and that are accelerating. One of them is longevity and the impact of the longer lifespan. You sometimes hear the term 100-year life, where people are expected to live longer. That means people will work longer, some out of necessity and some because they want to. And so what does that mean for organizations? Are we ready for that workforce? Are we ready to have the kind of experience that more mature workers might be seeking? And certainly as we think about distributed work and working from home, that's one way that we can tap into that workforce in a way perhaps we couldn't have before. The other acceleration that's happening there is just the face of Canada. About 20% of Canada, or 22%, are visible minorities today. In the next 15 years, that's expected to be somewhere between 35 and 40%. And so diversity and inclusion is not just a nice to do, but being really, really good at inclusion is critical to the talent and the business strategies. The third theme we're seeing is around societal trends. Customers, communities, employees have different expectations of the role of business. We hear about the notion of profits with purpose. And all of these stakeholder groups really asking the question, what is the business doing to have an impact on the greater good of the community or of society? And we're certainly seeing that with the workforce as well. We see that at Deloitte. People are very interested in what is it that you're doing as an organization when they're joining us to have that kind of impact, and how do you actually make it possible for me as an employee to have impact in the community. Next slide. So as I was saying, this is really COVID has us forward, has pushed us forward with very little planning, and we've actually managed quite well in many ways. And I think it speaks to the capacity of people to learn and to adapt when there is a burning platform. Next slide. We hear a lot about this term, the skills economy, and the skills are, the way I think about it, they really are the new currency in the future of work. Here's some data. There's a lot of data out there, and the numbers might be slightly different, but I think what this really punctuates is the numbers are big. The first couple come from an RBC report, 25% of jobs heavily disrupted, 50% requiring significant overhaul of skills. And as we look at some of the other numbers, and this is a global number which would apply to Canada, I think these are OECD numbers, over 50% of adults neither train nor want to train. It's missing a neither. 50% of adults neither train nor want to train. And that's actually quite a staggering number. And what I take away from that is that the training and skill building that we provide will have to, it can't be a one size fits all. We really need to meet the needs of the different topics. Just a reminder for everyone to have their phone on mute, please. And so the gap between the skills offered by the labor market and those required by companies is continuing to grow. So it really, and this is very much in some ways a pre-COVID conversation, but we will get back to this level where it's not a shortage of people, but it's a shortage of skills. Next slide. You've seen a lot of the numbers. This is the impact of COVID. I'm not going to go through and read the slide. You can see it, but headline here is that people in low-paying jobs, which tend to be more women and minorities, new immigrants, have been impacted more in terms of unemployment. And as we're seeing the rebound in the lower wage work, men are actually going back into the workforce faster. So there is a growing gap there between the impact on women and men, and also women with children and men with children, where the women with children are going back into the workforce at a slower rate, and often because they play a primary role in childcare. So the message here is, what are we going to do to help the different groups get back into the workforce, and how are we going to make sure we're not going to lose some of the progress that we've actually made in that space? Yeah, you can flip to the next one. So this continuing on this move from jobs to skills, couple of things that are driving it. One is the half-life of technical skills. So, this is 50% of the skill or the knowledge is obsolete within 3 to 5 years. When I started my career many decades ago at RBC, the half-life of technical skills was 30 years. So at that stage, it was you go to school, you work, and you retire. Well, clearly that's not the case now, and going to school, reskilling, upskilling is something that has to happen throughout the lifetime of people. Next slide. So at this stage, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Karen, who's going to talk a little bit more, do some more sort of double clicking on the technology AI front.
And hello, everybody. Let's just, a lot of the research that we've done that has contributed to our human capital trends is asking the fundamental question of how do we anticipate in the future that we would see a greater collaboration and integration between the human worker and the machine worker. And this is what this is one of the key sort of narratives that you would read when you look at the research that we've done. And how do you rethink how you design the work that human beings do, such that they can create space and capacity to do that deeper thinking and to do that more creative, innovative thinking that for many years is being used to do more tasks that are more receptive to automation and more of a turnkey solution through the use of machines. And so when we talk about the investment in things like artificial intelligence, this has been a theme that we've been talking about in the marketplace for a couple of years now. And I think what the current situation around COVID has done is actually bring this into sharp focus. And it's creating many questions from many businesses to think through, how could we actually maintain an increased level of automation? Because over the last several weeks, it's actually driven us to be thinking quite differently and quite creatively about our workflows. And how do we make those more sustainable over time? Next slide, please. We also have had a very strong, and Zabeen, you can comment extensively on this topic around the shortage of certain skills. And again, we'll come back to this a little bit later on, but like I said earlier, the shift in, and Zabeen commented as well, the shift in sort of consumer behavior and the way that people are consuming different types of products or services that we've seen over the last several weeks has really been driving, like I said, the increased focus on automation, the creation of what we're calling super teams. It sounds like a trendy buzzword, but this is around how do we actually build teams where you have human beings working alongside machines? And how do we actually not just alongside, but in an integrated way such that we view both the machine and the human as part of one team, and they could not solely exist into themselves. And so that's a term that I think, whether we use the term super team or an alternative, but that construct of workers and machines coming together to actually create a greater level of value is something I think we're going to see a lot more conversation about over the coming years. I won't go into all of the statistics on here, but just suffice it to say that it just really starts to tie together the need to shift from focusing on jobs to focusing on skills and the creation of new skills in our workforces going forward. Next slide. So let me give you a bit of a frame of how we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to questions. What we'd like to do now, if we can drop to the next slide, slide 10, is actually take you through some of the really big accelerators that Zabeen mentioned and Leah mentioned in her opening comments around the future of work. These are accelerators that we have seen just come into really sharp focus over the last several weeks, a couple of months or so. And they feel different now. We've been talking about a number of these topics. You'll be reading through them right now, likely, and you'll say, yeah, we've been talking about these topics over the last several years, but I think we've changed the lens on them. So let's jump into each of these and let's talk about what it means in terms of accelerating the future of work. Next slide, please. Let me start by talking about radical transparency. If you can go back up one slide, please. Thank you. And I've had so many conversations with many of our clients around the reflections that leaders and executive teams have had about the last 3 months. Probably the number one thing that exec teams would say to us that they have become really focused on, but it's been a great learning for them as leaders, it is the value of transparency, of active listening, and of communication. And not just communicating things once or twice, but ongoing reinforcement of communication on key messages. This engenders trust, the transparency engenders trust as well, and actually taking sentiment on an ongoing basis of your employee base, particularly over the last several weeks, has been absolutely paramount to understand how they're feeling, maintaining the health and safety of your workforces, but as well starting to anticipate how different parts of your workforce may wish or may not wish to come back into your workforce in a physical context. And so this whole idea of radical transparency, active listening, and integrating into that listening strategy how employee sentiment on an ongoing basis. And we've seen many models from many of our clients around very short pulses, surveys that organizations are taking with their people, and they're taking direction from the feedback that they get, and are adapting different strategies and tactics to help us think differently about how to manage that workforce going forward. Next slide, please. touch a little bit more on trust, and you will see that there's a lot of conversation about the increasing value and emphasis executive teams are placing on this construct of trust, particularly over the last several months. And we at Deloitte, we've written extensively on trust and that trust as a value creation strategy. And so what we thought we would do is just tie that into this whole idea of radical transparency, because the two largely go hand in hand. And I think certainly in the conversations that we've been having over several weeks with executive teams, really looking deeply at what that means for your organization. How do you maintain trust both with your employees, but your broader stakeholder group over time in a sustainable way, and in a way that, again, engenders a greater level of collaboration and longevity to those relationships. If you're interested in reading more about this, you can see some of our reports on the topic of trust and a way of value creation at Deloitte.com. Let's just drop down one page, please. I will just flag the detail that is on this page here around that value creation that I talked about, and just reinforce some of the comments that Zabeen made at the beginning around trust and how you create that trust. Is a very human experience for people, and it needs to be a very human experience. And I think that largely what we've experienced in the last few months, that is, again, it has really landed front and center for people around creating that authentic human experience for people in the way that we treated people as we were in the early stages of lockdown, how we've maintained engagement with people over that period, and how we actually think about bringing people back into the workplace. So when we're talking about trust here, we've broadened the definition to be inclusive of trust that you will be safe in your physical space, that financially, that there is open, transparent conversation around the current context relative to what that means for you as an individual, but also as a company. Trust as it relates to that your emotional needs are being met and are being safeguarded. And again, many discussions with organizations around people's degree of readiness for coming back into the workforce. It's a very personal and a very emotional sentiment that we need to keep a pulse on. Then lastly, the idea, the construct around trust that your information is secure and that there are privacy and controls around that information. So digital, that your digital safety net's being paramount there. Sabine, did you want to add anything to the conversation that we're having around trust and that being front and center?
Yeah, I think you've really covered it well, Karen, and it's interesting as you point out. I think every client conversation has both of these elements in the conversation, and even something which seems pretty straightforward, communication. People spontaneously jump in with the one thing I've learned is that it's the importance of communication. And I was with a group of CFOs at our Deloitte offices, or virtually, but in BC not that long ago. And that was the key learning that one of the CFOs put out there was, you know what, I've realized how important it is, and not just the group conversation, but he said, I set aside half an hour a day so I can speak to two people one-on-one. And this is the right thing to do, but it also really drives engagement and performance ultimately. So really that back to the basics in some way is back in style. And the transparency element, I think the fact that decisions, there's no playbook, and decisions require to really draw out knowledge from the source as opposed to the normal hierarchy, has driven people to also be more transparent so they can better solve the problems when they've actually put them on the table. And the notion even of vulnerability, being able to say, you know what, I don't have all the answers, is certainly also popping up. So the future of work truly is human.
I had an issue with my mute button there. I apologize. Zabeen, I think you were going to deep dive into some of the
Okay, yeah.
a little bit more detail on skills.
Yeah, so let's go back to the skills. And this is not a new conversation in terms of reskilling, upskilling, and how long have we been talking about lifelong learning? Probably my entire lifetime. And we need within organizations, people are really starting to push a little bit more on being proactive around this. So it's not about let's wait till the person has their job has either been changed dramatically or is no longer required, to what can we do ahead of time to reskill and upskill people. I spoke earlier about over 50% of adults neither train nor want to train. So there's a motivational issue around there in terms of how do you actually get people to train, because that's a big part of it. I think a really big opportunity right now at a broader economy level, there are a lot of people today that have been unemployed or that have been furloughed. And so we've got all that excess capacity there. What can we do to use that capacity to actually develop new skills, so when the jobs are recreated, and they will be different, that people will be able to go into those jobs more easily? How can we create those pathways? And which takes me back to Karen's conversation around AI and that integration. One of the things that we have seen from previous recessions, the last 4, the investment in automation actually went up. That feels a bit counterintuitive, but what happens is organizations look at their investment portfolio, and as their business models change, which a crisis often drives, the jobs and the kind of work that's required changes as well, and that's when the automation is brought in to actually accelerate their some of their growth, and that means new skill requirements for people. So
Zabeen, sorry, Zabeen, just a couple of comments on top of that I think are very interesting in terms of how COVID has accelerated the capacity for people to reskill. There are so many stories that we could share in terms of both very large employers in Canada down to the smallest employer, and how they have pre-COVID were on a journey to take inventory of all the skills that they had and the transferability of those skills into new types of work. And this was taking not just months, but it was a years, if not multiple years endeavor, particularly when you're in a very large, complex organization. What COVID did was actually allow them to move large segments of their workforce. And I can think of, whether we're talking about banks, telecommunications companies, consumer companies, retail companies, and they have picked up segments of their workforce and got them redeployed into totally different roles very, very quickly. And so I think what a lot of businesses right now are saying, how do we retain the nimbleness that we actually were able to take advantage of when we had to, and B, how much is that going to really ignite people to want to look for reskilling opportunities and to want to look for more mobility around an organization, and how do we capture that? Because my view is that pre-COVID, that reskilling through mobility and redeployment, it was hard to mobilize at scale. And we have accelerated the at-scale component of that quite materially over the last several months. How do we bottle that within our organizations so that we can help people build new skills, make them future ready?
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, great points. Yeah. And certainly with the banks, as you point out, as they started to administer the government programs, what they did was they asked employees to tell them what skills that they had, because they had no choice. They didn't have, as you say, the time, and within days redeployed hundreds and thousands of people. And internal mobility, I think consulting, professional services is a great example of internal mobility, in that people go from project to project. So they really develop the adaptability and that ability to learn. And I spent my career at RBC, and certainly the same applied there with a lot of internal mobility. And that's certainly that builds probably the most important skill, which is the ability to learn rapidly and the motivation. And it becomes what people actually look for. So let's move to the next slide. We know that digital fluency is table stakes. We don't need to be coders, but we certainly need digital fluency. And we're seeing how we're working today, certainly using the different technologies for video calls is one thing that's become clear. And the other thing around digital fluency that we maybe don't think about all the time is our smartphones. This has more computing power than the computer used to get Apollo 11 to the moon. And this is our partner. It isn't taking, it's not taking our jobs away. It's actually helping to, by and large, helping to make us more productive and very integrated into our lives. So we're a team. This is probably a super team. And and that's something that's going to continue at work. So moving from the technical skills, next slide, please. We're certainly seeing the rise of the human skills. And you've seen, again, there are many lists out there, but I think what this really captures here is the main kinds of skills that you'll see on any list. And what I find quite interesting through COVID, these are actually the skills that we've relied on. We've needed to be adaptable. We've needed to collaborate in very different ways. Communication, we've already talked about that. Creative problem solving. Answers, no playbook. We have to be really curious and try to figure it out. Rapid learning, resiliency, empathy. And so just as I think with future of work, a lot of people were of the view, well, that's in the future. And Karen and I certainly would be talking about, well, the future is now. I think we're seeing the same thing with human skills. It's not an abstract concept. It's actually something that allows you to do different kind of work, to pivot quickly. And the big question here, though, is how do you actually develop those skills? I think that's what organizations are working through, because this is experiential. How do you develop them? How do you assess them? How do you reward people for them? I see this as the opportunity now to really accelerate that and to involve our employees in helping us. Let's learn from the experience we've just gone through in terms of how these skills were developed, and then be able to replicate those learning moments in more normal times. Next slide, please. So the soft stuff really is the hard stuff. These are the enduring and transferable skills. Back to you, Karen.
So let's move on to the next topic, and obviously none of these topics are necessarily mutually exclusive, but let's talk about mental health and well-being for a moment, because I think in terms of one of the areas that COVID has accelerated, this is probably one of the top 3 areas, I would say. We have gone through just such a whirlwind of emotion on a personal level, at the family level, at the team level within the workplace, at an organizational level in terms of mental well-being and health. And it affects absolutely every single one of us. It's an incredibly inclusive topic. And so I think what we have seen over the last little while has been many organizations responding in perhaps ways that they had not anticipated needing to respond in terms of the level of support, the pressure and the expectations of leaders to be mindful of mental health of themselves, but also of their teams, and actually building sort of capability within themselves to have, as we were mentioning earlier, really authentic and real conversations about how people are doing. and being able to respond in a way that's meaningful for each and every individual person, because it's impacted every one of us differently. And I would say it's impacted us all differently at different times. And so where perhaps, we have never experienced such a large event as this before in our workplaces to this extent, nor have we experienced such variations in how our workforce is feeling at any given point in time. So this has really come to the forefront in terms of the both the issue, the conversation about mental health and well-being within the executive and boardrooms, and as well, I think will continue. And in fact, if anything, you get much more of a conversation and a very real issue for our businesses to be thinking through very strategically. If we can get to the next page. At its foundational level, it's been absolutely about keeping our workforces safe and healthy. I think as we move into bringing workers back onto site or into offices, that will continue. I think levels of anxiety and stress related to returning to the workforce. Certainly, many of our clients and ourselves at Deloitte, as we've been doing our sentiment testing and doing our pulse tests, people don't necessarily feel like they're in a rush to come back into the workforce. They are happy to wait until they feel that it is safe and that all of the required precautions and processes and protocols are in place such that they feel safe, that they feel trust that those protocols are there, and that they can remain healthy. And so I think keeping our finger constantly on the pulse relative to how people are feeling about coming back, not assuming that people are ready just because the doors can be opened, is absolutely critical. We're also seeing, organizations start to think differently about how they structure things like their total reward packages relative to well-being benefits, mental health support. And there's some really interesting organizations doing things in the marketplace that I think is going to fundamentally challenge how we think about putting together total reward packages for our workforces over the medium, longer term. You can test that hypothesis over the next year or so, but that's one of the hypotheses that we have right now. Zabeen?
Okay, so moving on to the next theme, and that's really around inclusion. And as we went through the demographic data, one thing that's pretty clear is diversity is actually a fact in our broader workforce, whereas inclusion is a choice that we make as leaders and a choice that we make as individuals. This could be a presentation in and of itself, so I'm just going to touch on a couple of areas that really relate specifically to COVID. And one is, I talked earlier about the disproportionate impact of job loss on certain groups, women, minorities, new immigrants. And so as organizations, as we're thinking about return to work and bringing people back on, we're going to have to look at different kinds of approaches and programs and potentially partnerships with educational institutions, with governments, to ensure that we actually are, they are coming back into the workforce at not disproportionate levels to other groups. The very topical issue, of course, now is in the last few weeks, really, what we are seeing is a reckoning with anti-Black racism. It's become a global movement, really, ignited by the killing of George Floyd, but certainly a deep-rooted systemic issue for a long time. And organizations are very focused on addressing those. If I go back to the trends, you've got the demographic trends, and you also have the changing societal expectations, customers, employees, communities, and even shareholders. Institutional shareholders are paying a lot of attention to these kinds of issues and with the ESG, the environmental social governance lens. And so it really is an issue that needs to be addressed in an accelerated way. I think what people are looking for is for us to act in COVID time. If you think about some of the other things and how fast we've moved, this is the challenge here is to not really be stuck and frozen in we need more facts, we need more data, we need to do more listening and learning. We absolutely do, but at the same time, we have sufficient data to be able to move on certain things and starting to address both the systemic barriers in the system as well as organizational cultures. And mental health would be another example where we've made really good progress over the last few years. It started with some data, but now it's certainly becoming a lot more normalized. And I expect to see this trend move in that same direction. Next slide, please. Is probably the biggest issue that's talked about and the biggest change through COVID, and many call it the biggest experiment, or really we kind of went from a very small number of people working from home to massive numbers, no piloting, no certainly lots of test and learn as we've been moving forward. They say that habits are formed in 60 days, and so that means that a lot of us actually have formed our routines around this. And the first thing I would say is I like the term distributed work or workforce as opposed to remote work. To me, remote suggests that people are in the outskirts. There's a big center where careers are made and where the action really is. And distributed just feels like it feels much more equitable in one where there's no advantage or disadvantage to an individual in terms of where they're doing the work. We're talking with a couple of clients earlier today on a call that we do at Deloitte with HR leaders. This was definitely something we talked about quite a bit. And the principle for me here in terms of how we manage that is really striking that balance between office and home, and that optimal as opposed to one or the other, this blended approach that ends up being a win-win for everyone. And let me just break that down and double click a little bit on that. Next slide, please. You've got on the employee side, and what the kinds of things we're hearing is, I love that I have no commute. I'm able to better integrate my work and life, more time with family, more autonomy. On the flip side, the people are saying, I don't know when work starts and when work stops. Everything is blended in. I'm actually working a lot longer, and we're seeing that in the data as well. People are even saying this extreme togetherness with my family, it's too much. So I'll let each of us think that through on our own. And Zoom fatigue, or video call fatigue certainly comes up. I think the big piece though is really around isolation. They're missing the social contact, and that's something that I see as being connected to good mental health and well-being, and that to me is one of the big drivers for some kind of a blended approach where people are socially coming together. And it may be distributed, it may not be in the center location. So if you're a bank, for example, people could get together in the bank branch and work from there one day a week, for example, but still get that social contact. Let's move to the next slide, please. For organizations, I think the big piece is less real estate footprint, and that I would say is probably the greatest pro. And the investment in technology has already been made in many cases which was the barrier before. They're asking questions though, like, how do you, can you go to the next slide, please? I'm going to just speed up a little bit here just to give time for questions. How do you stimulate creativity and innovation? At Deloitte, we have very open spaces. There are these natural collisions, we call them, where people meet up, where ideas are sparked. Is this good for productivity or bad for productivity? And we hear both sides in terms of that. How do you, I think the biggest question that's being asked is, how do you nurture and sustain culture, but also how do you change culture as organization strategies change and as the environment changes? There's a need to change culture, and how do you do that when you're not physically together? So those are things that, questions that we're still working through. Slide, which might be back to you, Karen.
Yeah, just a couple of comments before we open up for questions on the topic of leadership and culture, which were a couple of the last accelerated areas. Really interesting conversations about sort of the capabilities that have been absolutely critical over the last several months. And if in a nutshell I could capture that, I'll use a quote from a conversation Zabeen and I were in this morning, which is, this gives us the potential to look at leadership differently, and it gives us the opportunity to define what leadership potential looks like differently. When we've asked many leaders over the last several weeks, what does that actually mean? What has been revealed through the pandemic in terms of your leadership cohort within your business? Some of the things that people have found interesting are, where they see leaders exhibiting more empathy and greater care. They're seeing leaders show greater or lesser degrees of adaptability, so placing greater value on that adaptability capability. The leaders that are shining through what we're going through right now as well are very, very good at removing or reducing hierarchy so that work can get done. And so they don't feel bound or constrained by what has been a more traditional sort of organizational structure, and we all feel that or have felt that in our careers. And being able to break down those barriers so that work can get done across those silos, across those functional domains, is a capability of leadership. And so how do you actually sustain that over time when there will be a natural pull back to the old ways of doing things potentially? And then the other attribute that people are saying has been interesting to watch in leaders is those that are consciously reducing the amount of those sort of controlling behaviors, if you will, and are letting people feel empowered and make decisions and take choices much deeper into their organization than perhaps they have done in the past, both for speed and expediency, but also it's actually helping people develop at much more of a rapid rate. There's some really interesting switches in terms of what leadership potential is now starting to look like and how people are showing up. So, I often reflect on favorite questions that we ask of our guests on some of the sessions that we run within our firm is, what have you learned as a leader? And if we can carry anything with us over the next several months or years, I think some of those areas are things that we should look deeply into, each and every one of us as leaders. Next page, just a quick comment on culture. And I do think that, again, just given where we are, my observation would be, and Sabine, I know you share this, is that it's all too easy for us to sort of go back to how things were if we let it. And we are in a window of opportunity right now for us to think quite differently about how we can evolve our organization's culture, build more of that adaptability that I just talked about into how we do things, really embrace the distributed work model to the extent that it makes sense for your business, and build in new routines to make it more sustainable. Zabeen's comment earlier about digital fluency, I think a lot of organizations right now are a lot of technology that they have learned to use very, very rapidly. But at the same time, we likely haven't really tapped into the full potential of that technology to help us manage things like productivity, collaboration and connection. And so again, I would entertain a conversation with any one of you around how can we actually build more muscle around some of that digital fluency and some of those leadership capabilities that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to stop there. We are running out of time almost for questions, which we don't want to do. So with that, back to you, Leah, for some questions that may have come from the group.
First of all, Zabeen and Karen, thank you. That was encompassing. It was practical, but I also really enjoyed it because of the positivity of that. And I also do apologize to the two of you and to all the participants. Being some technical issues like I've never experienced before, so I apologize. I'm going to jump directly to the questions in the interest of time, and I appreciate people, including our speakers, might have to drop off because of timing. But the first question here, Zabeen and Karen, is that you reference skills, reskilling, lifelong learning. Where can and should employers and employees even start with this?
Do you want me to jump in?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think that I would start by saying we need to jump in. There isn't a perfect approach to this, but what I've seen organizations do, and I will actually use an RBC example. They looked at their branch network. They have 1,000 people. And what they know is that the jobs there's more and more that's going to be automated, the use of AI, and that's been going on for decades, actually. So they had this very transparent conversation with employees and saying, we don't know exactly what the jobs are going to look like, know exactly when it's going to happen. This was pre-COVID, but here's how the customer needs are changing. Here's the move to digital. There's going to be more advice. And so first, those difficult conversations of let's tell them the truth and let's say we don't have all the answers. And then they identified, actually from the human skills list, they identified the skills that they thought were going to be most critical to move in the direction they knew they were going. And it was collaboration and actually they called it radical communication, I think. And then they developed training. They offered online as well as experiential. And for that year or 6 months or a year, they focused specifically on building that skill, building their muscle there, and really that critical mass. So that's one approach to actually move forward on it. There are a lot of different approaches on digital skills where you can do much more online. And so those could be done in actually probably a lot faster. And even right now, where even people who are working, some are working really hard and have too much to do, and others actually aren't able to do all their work from home. And so how do we use that time through digital platforms to develop the digital skills?
Great, thanks. And I appreciate there's lots of approaches, but what I heard out of that too was the identification. That's the first, or one of the first pieces in order to know what to address. So I mean, I'm looking through the questions here, and Karen, I think this might be one for you that says, how can employers, it's around mental health, how can employers continue to support employees' well-being as this crisis continues, and with new concerns you had talked about in the return to work, reopening, and then the third layer is also, especially from just in a distributive work, that environment.
Yeah, no, great question. I think first and foremost, it's keeping the communication channels open so that you understand how the needs change over time, first and foremost. So understanding what's pertinent is sort of job number one, if you will, and then being able to being able to show that you are actively listening in terms of the feedback that you're getting. So it's one thing taking the feedback, but you have to be able to demonstrate that you're actively listening and responding in a way that makes sense. And so, additional support around self-care, and there are many, many resources out there that I think, you know, a number of organizations and a number of providers actually in the market have tried to bring together into a central sort of forum, whether we're talking about you know, some of the models that you can see from some of the vendors out there. Mono Chappelle, as an example, have tried to aggregate a lot of resources that you can actually tap into at the organizational level, but also at a very personal level, that gets to all of those different types of wellness that I talked about: financial, psychological, mental wellness, physical wellness. So there is a lot out there, and I think a lot of providers are trying to aggregate it into one place so that it makes it easy for us as consumers of it. So listening, active listening, and adjusting the model, I think, as needed.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question we have here, and it might be our last one. We'll see if we'll have time for one more after that, but it says, a year from now, will we be grappling with the same challenges have changed? What will be the focus?
$1 million question.
Yeah, but I think still, like, are we still going to be addressing, like, are these issues going to continue, or will we be able to address them in the you know, over the next year and be moving on to other things? I'm going to extrapolate the question.
I think thematically, these issues, these areas will be the same. The pace of change has been accelerating for quite some time, and that's not going to change. So the activities that we do under those themes may be different, but I think they will remain critical in terms of culture. How do we develop leaders faster? There's a big theme of speed here. We've got some accelerators. We know how to develop leaders more quickly. So how do we go about that? Skills revolution is not going to go away. And the same around, we've set a new bar for transparent communication. That train has left the station. We can't go back. And mental health, it's already, you know, it's been the World Health Organization or the UN, one of the two, declared it really as a major issue before COVID. And we know the numbers, and we know it's younger people are being more and more impacted. So honestly, I think that's the new list, and this whole empathetic, caring, compassionate environment that's been created. I think what organizations are seeing, it actually works. People have been able to work, whether it's at home or the essential workers. So 5 million people are working from home, or have been up in May and April. And the essential workers in the front lines, they are going to work, doing the work. They are committed. And I would say it's because many of these things have been put in place. And so organizations are seeing, and that's for, you know, we probably need to end here, that the soft stuff is actually the hard stuff. It drives engagement, it drives productivity. And so it's both the right thing and the smart thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. There are other questions, but I do take your point. And what I do really enjoy about this, Zabeen and Karen, who's now left, is that message of, you know, it's already happening in the positivity, because there is so much anxiety about the future of work, about relationship with automation, about our mental health well-being. And I think, you know, I did call you distinguished, and I meant it, Zabeen and Karen, because you provide so many insights and you frame them in a way that we can be positive going forward. And vis-a-vis that question, I think we will invite you back a year, maybe even before that, to take a look at these trends and where we are, but helping us frame it in a way that we can actually take it, it's not so overwhelming, and it's a positive way. And you know, no one would wish this crisis on anyone, of course, but the fact that it's here, that we can take this and bring it forward. So I thank the both of you. I thank Deloitte, and I thank all of our participants for being here today. Stay safe, be kind, and thanks everyone. Enjoy what's left of your days here.
Yeah, thank you for having us. And certainly if you've got questions, feel free to pop them to me through LinkedIn. and I'm happy to respond to them. And we have lots of our information on there as well. So
and
take
Zabeen, yes, everybody, there's a wealth of information, and we will share the last slide that had your information and Deloitte.
Yeah, perfect, and lots of Deloitte information. Lovely. Thank you very much for having us. Bye, everyone.
Everyone, goodbye.